I saw my Christmas gift under the table before anyone even said my name. It was supposed to be a small thing, just another family dinner, the kind I had hosted for over 40 years, the kind where the smell of roasted turkey filled every corner of the house and soft carols played in the background like a promise that everything was still whole. I had spent 2 days preparing that meal, standing in my kitchen measuring, stirring, tasting, making sure every dish was exactly the way Daniel used to love when he was a boy, when he would sneak in and steal pieces of ham before dinner and grin like it was our little secret. The dining room looked beautiful that evening, the long oak table polished until it reflected the warm glow of the string lights I had hung along the walls, each place setting carefully arranged with the good china I only brought out once a year. Ashley sat across from me, smiling that perfect, practiced smile of hers, the one that never quite reached her eyes, while Daniel sat beside her, nodding along to everything she said, as if it were the only voice in the room worth hearing. I noticed at the moment everyone began passing out gifts, bright boxes wrapped in shiny paper, laughter filling the air as ribbons were untied and paper tore softly in eager hands. I waited, hands folded in my lap, watching as each person received something thoughtful, something chosen just for them, until I realized no one was looking at me at all. That was when my eyes drifted downward, almost by accident, and I saw it, a small box wrapped in silver paper, tucked halfway under the edge of the tablecloth, hidden just enough that no one else would notice unless they were looking for it. My gift. I didn't move. I didn't say a word. I simply watched as Ashley leaned forward, guiding the conversation away from me with gentle ease, asking questions, laughing at the right moments, making sure the spotlight never drifted in my direction. Daniel didn't look at me once. Not when I shifted in my seat. Not when my fingers tightened slightly against the fabric of my dress. Not even when I cleared my throat softly, as if to remind him I was still there. The room felt warm, almost too warm, yet something cold settled deep in my chest, something quiet and steady. I had seen enough dinners, enough holidays, enough small moments like this to understand when something was not an accident. And as I sat there, listening to the laughter that no longer felt like it belonged to me, I realized this wasn't about a forgotten gift. It was about something much more deliberate, something planned. And for the first time that night, I began to wonder how long it had been happening right in front of me without me truly seeing it. I kept my eyes on that small silver box for the rest of the evening, even as conversation rose and fell around me like waves I no longer belonged to. And the more I listened, the more I began to notice the little things that had once slipped past me without question, the way Ashley answered for Daniel before he could speak, the way she gently redirected every topic back to herself or to their plans, their future, their life. A life that seemed to have no space left for me in it. I remembered how different it used to be, how Daniel would call me every Sunday without fail, how he would ask for my recipes, how he once insisted that no holiday felt complete unless it was in this house with me at the head of the table. But that version of him felt distant now, like a photograph left too long in the sun, fading at the edges until it was hard to tell what had ever been real. Ashley laughed at something one of the guests said, a light, effortless sound, and placed her hand over Daniel's as if to anchor him there beside her, and he smiled back at her in a way I realized I had not seen directed at me in a very long time. My fingers rested quietly in my lap, but I could feel the faint tremor beneath my skin, not from anger, not even from sadness, but from a growing awareness that this moment was not isolated, that it was simply the clearest example of something that had been unfolding slowly, carefully, over time. I thought about last Thanksgiving when I arrived early to help set the table, and Ashley had told me everything was already handled, her tone polite but firm, leaving me standing in the doorway holding a pie that suddenly felt unnecessary. I thought about Daniel's birthday earlier that year when the celebration had been moved to a restaurant at the last minute, and I had been informed only after everyone had already gathered, as if my presence had become optional, something to be considered rather than expected. Each memory settled into place like pieces of a puzzle I had not realized I was assembling, and with each piece the picture became clearer, sharper, harder to ignore. Across the table, a gift bag was handed to Ashley, something large and carefully chosen, and the room filled again with admiration and compliments, and she accepted them with that same composed smile, thanking everyone as if she were graciously receiving something she had always known was hers. No one mentioned the small silver box beneath the table. No one looked down. It was as if it did not exist at all. I shifted slightly in my chair, just enough to feel the edge of the box brush against my shoe, a quiet reminder that I was not imagining it, that it was real, that it had been placed there intentionally. I lifted my gaze slowly and let it rest on Daniel for a moment longer than I had before, waiting, just waiting, to see if something in him would change, if some instinct, some memory of who we had been to each other, would surface and bring his attention back to me. But he only nodded along to whatever Ashley was saying, his focus fixed entirely on her. And in that stillness, I understood something I had been resisting for longer than I cared to admit. This was not forgetfulness. This was not carelessness. This was a choice. And as that realization settled quietly into place, I felt something inside me shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a calm certainty that I could not ignore, the kind that does not ask for permission and does not fade once it arrives. I let the moment, but not entirely out of reach, as if someone wanted it hidden but still present, a quiet message without words. I leaned down slightly, adjusting the napkin in my lap as though I were simply making myself more comfortable, and from that angle I could see it more clearly now, the neat crease of the wrapping paper, the ribbon tied too carefully for something meant to be forgotten. When I straightened again, Ashley was watching me, just for a second, her eyes flicking down toward the table before returning to her conversation, and that small glance told me more than anything she could have said out loud. She knew I had seen it, and she was waiting to see what I would do. I did nothing. I reached for my glass of water and took a small sip, letting the quiet settle back into place, letting her believe that I would follow the same pattern I always had, that I would stay polite, stay quiet, stay out of the way. Across the table, Daniel laughed again. Something about a story from work, his voice easy, relaxed, completely untouched by the tension that now sat clearly in my chest. And I wondered when he had learned to separate himself so completely from me, when he had decided that whatever was happening here was not something he needed to acknowledge. A few minutes later, one of the younger children, Emily, leaned over the table, her voice bright and unfiltered in the way only a child's could be, and she pointed toward the floor without even realizing what she was doing. "Grandma, your present is under there," she said, her tone full of simple confusion rather than accusation, and for a brief moment the room shifted. The conversation paused just enough for the words to land, just enough for a silence to form between us all, thin but unmistakable. Ashley's smile tightened, barely, and she let out a soft laugh as if it were nothing at all, as if the situation were too small to deserve real attention. "Oh, that," she said lightly, waving her hand in a dismissive gesture. "I must have said it there earlier while we were organizing everything. It just slipped my mind." Her voice was smooth, practiced, the explanation ready before the question had even fully formed, and she turned her attention immediately to someone else at the table, pulling the focus away as quickly as it had appeared. No one questioned her. No one followed up. Daniel did not even look down. I nodded once, slowly, as if I accepted the explanation, as if it made perfect sense that a gift would be placed out of sight and then forgotten in a room where everything else had been handled with such careful attention. I did not reach for the box. I did not ask for it to be brought up. Instead, I sat back in my chair and let the moment pass, because something in the way she had answered, in the speed of it, in the certainty, told me that this was not the first time she had needed to explain something like this away. And as the conversation resumed and the laughter returned, I realized that the real question was not why the gift had been hidden, but how many other things had been quietly moved out of sight while I was still sitting right here at the table. I let Ashley's explanation settle over the table like a thin layer of dust, barely noticeable if you did not look closely, but impossible to ignore once you did. And I found myself thinking not about the box anymore, but about the ease with which she had redirected the moment, how quickly everyone had accepted her version of events without question, as if that was simply how things worked now, as if her words carried more weight than what was plainly visible right in front of us. I folded my hands again, resting them lightly against the fabric of my dress, and allowed my gaze to move around the room with a new kind of attention, slower, more deliberate, taking in details I might have once overlooked, the way Ashley had arranged the seating so that she sat at the center of every conversation, the way Daniel leaned toward her whenever she spoke, his body angled slightly away from me without even realizing it, and the way the others seemed to follow her lead, laughing when she laughed, nodding when she spoke, as if she had quietly taken control of the rhythm of the evening. It was subtle, almost elegant in its execution, and I could not help but feel a quiet recognition of the precision behind it, the kind that does not come from a single decision, but from many small choices made over time. I thought back further, beyond the recent holidays, to moments that had once felt insignificant, like the time Ashley suggested we rotate hosting duties so that it would be fair for everyone, only for those rotations to gradually shift until I was no longer included at all, or the way she would gently correct stories I told, adding small details that changed the tone just enough to make me sound forgetful, out of step, like someone who was slowly losing her place. At the time, I had dismissed those things, told myself I was reading too much into them, that families changed, that dynamics evolved, but sitting there now, with the quiet weight of that hidden gift still pressing at the edge of my awareness, I could see how those moments connected, how they formed a pattern that was too consistent to be accidental. Across the table, Emily had already returned to her dessert, her earlier comment forgotten as easily as it had been spoken, and the rest of the room had followed her lead, slipping back into comfortable conversation as if nothing had happened at all. I reached for my fork and took a small bite of pie, tasting it without really registering the flavor, and allowed myself to observe rather than participate, to listen without responding, to exist within the room without trying to shape it the way I once would have. And in that quiet distance, something became clear in a way it had never been before, not as a sudden realization, but as a steady understanding that settled into place piece by piece, that this was not about a single act or a single evening, but about a shift in position, a slow and deliberate movement that had taken me from the center of my own family to the edges without ever asking for my permission. I glanced down once more, just briefly, at the small silver box still resting beneath the table, and this time I did not feel confusion or even hurt, but something calmer, something sharper, a sense that whatever had been happening here was not as invisible as they believed it to be, and that perhaps the real mistake was not that they had hidden it, but that they had assumed I would never truly see it. The rest of the evening unfolded exactly the way it was meant to, at least from Ashley's point of view, smooth, controlled, every conversation flowing in the direction she guided it, and I allowed it to continue without interruption, because for the first time I was no longer trying to hold on to what this dinner used to be. I was simply watching what it had become. I noticed how she excused herself at just the right moments, how she checked her phone with subtle glances, how she seemed to anticipate every shift in the room before it happened, and it struck me that this was not instinct, it was preparation. Daniel stood to refill drinks at one point, and as he passed behind me, his hand brushed lightly against the back of my chair, not quite a gesture of affection, not quite an accident, and he kept moving without pausing, without saying a word, as if even that small contact required no acknowledgement. I remembered when he used to pull out my chair for me, when he would ask if I needed anything before sitting down himself. Small gestures that once felt natural, but now seemed almost out of place in this carefully balanced environment. Across the table, Ashley began talking about their plans for the coming year, mentioning a possible move, something about a larger house, more space, better location, and she spoke as if the decision had already been made, as if it were simply a matter of informing the rest of us rather than including anyone in the conversation. I listened quietly, noting the way Daniel nodded along again, his agreement automatic, unexamined, and I wondered how many decisions had already been made in this same way, quietly, without ever reaching me. Then, almost as an afterthought, Ashley added that they might need to reconsider certain arrangements to make everything work, her tone light but deliberate, and she did not look at me when she said it, which somehow made it more pointed than if she had. No one asked what she meant. No one seemed curious, but I understood enough to recognize the direction of her words, the implication hanging just beneath the surface, and I felt that same calm. Awareness settled deeper into place. The gift under the table was not the beginning. It was not even the main point. It was a signal, a small, contained example of something much larger, something that had already been set in motion long before tonight. I let my gaze drift once more to the edge of the tablecloth where the silver paper still caught a faint reflection of the lights, and this time I did not feel the need to reach for it. or to bring it into the open. Instead, I leaned back slightly in my chair, allowing a small, almost imperceptible smile to touch my lips, because I realized that understanding what was happening gave me something I had not had before: clarity, and with it, a kind of quiet control that did not require anyone else's permission. They could continue their conversation, continue their plans, continue believing that everything was unfolding exactly as they intended, but I was no longer the person sitting at this table unaware of what was being taken from her. And that, more than anything else that had happened that night, was the moment everything truly began to change. By the time dessert plates were cleared and the last of the coffee was poured, the room had settled into a comfortable rhythm again, the kind that made everything appear normal from the outside, but I no longer felt the need to be part of it in the way I once had. Instead, I paid attention to the spaces between words, to the pauses that revealed more than the conversations themselves. And it was in one of those quiet moments that Emily slipped into the chair beside me, her small voice softer now, as if she sensed something had shifted even if she could not fully understand it. She leaned closer, her eyes glancing briefly toward Ashley before returning to me, and she spoke in a whisper that carried just enough weight to make everything else fade for a second. She said that earlier, before everyone arrived, she had seen Ashley move the box from the sideboard, where all the gifts had been placed, and slide it beneath the table, covering it carefully with the edge of the tablecloth. There was no confusion in her voice, no uncertainty, only the simple honesty of someone too young to realize the importance of what she was sharing. I nodded once, gently, placing my hand over hers for just a moment, a quiet acknowledgement that I had heard her, that I understood, and then I let her return to her seat without drawing any attention to the exchange. Across the table, Ashley was still speaking, still guiding the conversation as if nothing had changed, but now her movements seemed clearer to me, each gesture more deliberate, each smile more calculated, and I could see the effort behind the ease she presented to everyone else. Daniel laughed again at something she said, and I watched him more closely this time, noticing not just what he did, but what he chose not to do, the moments where he could have questioned, could have paused, could have simply looked at me and asked if everything was all right, and yet he did none of those things. It was not ignorance. It was allowance. And that distinction settled into place with a quiet finality that left no room for doubt. I took a slow breath, letting the air fill my lungs before releasing it just as calmly, and in that steady rhythm I felt something inside me align, a shift not driven by emotion but by clarity. The gift under the table was no longer a question, no longer something I needed to confirm or confront. It was evidence, simple and undeniable, of a pattern I could now see in full. I rested my hands lightly against the table and allowed my gaze to move once more across the faces around me, taking in the scene as it truly was, not as I had hoped it to be, and I understood that whatever came next would not be decided in this room, not in front of an audience, not in a moment shaped by someone else's design. Ashley believed she had controlled the narrative of the evening, that she had set the tone and guided every outcome, and perhaps she had, for now. But as I sat there in the quiet center of my own thoughts, I realized that control, like everything else, depended on what remained unseen, and for the first time, there was very little left that I did not see. When the evening finally began to wind down and chairs shifted softly against the floor, I remained seated a moment longer than everyone else, allowing the movement around me to pass without interruption, watching as coats were gathered, as voices lifted in casual goodbyes, as Ashley stood near the doorway receiving thanks for a night that had unfolded exactly as she intended. I rose slowly, smoothing my hands over the front of my dress, and only then did I bend slightly, just enough to reach beneath the table and lift the small silver box into my hands, its weight lighter than I expected, almost insignificant, yet somehow it carried more meaning than anything else in the room. No one noticed, or if they did, they chose not to react. I turned the box once, feeling the edges of the paper beneath my fingertips, and placed it quietly on the table beside me without opening it, letting it sit there in plain view for the first time that night. Ashley's eyes flicked toward it briefly as she helped someone with their coat, and for the smallest fraction of a second, something in her expression tightened, not enough for anyone else to see, but enough for me to recognize. I did not say a word. I simply met her gaze, held it for a moment longer than was comfortable, and then looked away as if nothing of importance had happened. Daniel approached me then, his tone light, almost distracted, asking if I needed help cleaning up, and I shook my head gently, telling him I would take care of it in the morning, that everything was fine, my voice steady, calm, giving him exactly what he expected to hear. He nodded, relieved perhaps, or simply satisfied that no complication had arisen, and returned to Ashley's side without another thought. I stood there for a moment longer, the room nearly empty now, the decorations still glowing softly against the quiet walls, and I allowed myself to take in the scene one last time, not with nostalgia, not with regret, but with a clear understanding of what it had become. Then I picked up the box again, holding it carefully in both hands, and walked toward the kitchen, placing it on the counter beneath the soft light without opening it, without even loosening the ribbon. It was not curiosity that stopped me. It was certainty. Whatever was inside that box no longer mattered in the way it once might have. What mattered was what had been revealed by where it had been placed, by who had placed it there, and by who had chosen to pretend they had not seen it. I turned off the lights one by one, the house growing quieter with each step, until only the faint glow from the kitchen remained, reflecting softly against the silver paper. And as I stood there in that stillness, I realized that the next move did not belong to them anymore, not to Ashley, not to Daniel, not to anyone who had sat at that table believing I would remain exactly where they had placed me. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt deliberate, and for the first time that night, it felt entirely mine. The house felt different once the door closed behind the last guest. Not empty in the way it had after other holidays, but settled, as if it were waiting for something to begin rather than mourning something that had ended. And I remained standing in the kitchen for a while, the small silver box resting exactly where I had placed it, untouched, unchanged, yet no longer hidden. I moved slowly, rinsing a glass, straightening a plate, letting my hands follow familiar routines while my mind arranged everything I had seen into something clearer, something that no longer relied on doubt or assumption. Ashley's words from earlier returned to me, the mention of new space, of changing arrangements, spoken lightly but placed with intention, and now, with everything else laid beside it, I could see the direction it pointed toward with quiet precision. This house had not simply been the setting for the evening. It had been part of the conversation, even when no one said so directly. I dried my hands carefully and leaned against the counter for a moment, looking out into the dimly lit dining room where the decorations still glowed softly, and I thought about how many decisions had already been made without me, how many conversations had happened in my absence, shaping a future that no longer included me in the way it once had. It was not sudden. That was the part that mattered most. It had been gradual, layered, each small adjustment leading naturally into the next, until the outcome felt inevitable to everyone except the person it affected most. I walked back into the dining room and began clearing the table piece by piece, lifting each plate, each glass, restoring the space to its quiet order. And as I worked, I allowed myself to revisit the evening without emotion, only observation, the placement of the gift, the quick explanation, the silence that followed, the absence of any question or concern from Daniel. Each moment fit together too well to be coincidence. When the table was finally cleared, I returned to the kitchen and stood once more in front of the unopened box, studying it not for what it contained, but for what it represented. I reached out and adjusted the ribbon slightly, not enough to undo it, just enough to feel the tension in the knot, and then I let my hand fall back to my side. Whatever they believed they were setting in motion, whatever plan had been quietly unfolding around me, it depended on one assumption, that I would continue to respond the way I always had, that I would accept, adjust, and eventually step aside without resistance. I turned off the kitchen light and moved toward the hallway, pausing only once to look back at the faint outline of the box and the dim glow that remained. And in that moment, I understood something with a certainty that left no room for hesitation. I did not need to open it to know its value. I already knew where I stood. And now, finally, I knew what needed to be done next. I woke up earlier than usual the next morning, the house still quiet, the kind of silence that settles deep before the rest of the world begins to move. And for a moment I stood in the doorway of the kitchen, looking at the small silver box exactly where I had left it, unchanged, waiting. The light from the window stretched across the counter, catching the edge of the ribbon, and I realized that for the first time in years, I did not feel the need to rush into the day, to prepare, to anticipate, to make everything right for everyone else before they even asked. Instead, I walked slowly to the coffee maker, measured out the grounds, poured the water, and let the simple rhythm of the morning unfold on my terms. I did not reach for the box. Not yet. I sat at the table with my coffee, wrapping my hands around the warmth of the mug, and allowed my thoughts to move forward instead of backward, not replaying the evening, but considering what came next with a clarity that felt steady rather than overwhelming. Ashley's voice echoed faintly in my memory, her mention of change, of new arrangements, and I could now see the outline of it more clearly, the expectation that I would eventually step aside, that this house, this life I had built piece by piece, would quietly shift into something that no longer belonged to me. I took a slow sip of coffee and set the mug down carefully, my movements deliberate, unhurried, and in that stillness I understood that whatever they had planned depended entirely on my silence, on my willingness to remain exactly where they had placed me, just like that box beneath the table, present but disregarded. I stood then, walked to the counter, and finally picked up the box, feeling its lightness again, the neatness of its wrapping, and this time I untied the ribbon slowly, not out of curiosity, but as a matter of completion, as if finishing a task that had already revealed everything it needed to reveal. Inside, there was something simple, something impersonal, the kind of gift that could have been chosen for anyone, without thought or care, and I closed the lid gently, placing it back on the counter without reaction. It was not what was inside that mattered. It never had been. I turned and looked around the kitchen, at the walls, the cabinets, the small details that had remained constant for so many years, and I felt a quiet certainty settle into place, stronger now, more defined. This was my home, not by accident, not by assumption, but by every choice, every effort, every day I had invested in it. And for the first time, I allowed myself to consider what it would mean to protect that, not with confrontation or raised voices, but with the same calm precision I had used to build it in the first place. I reached for my phone then, scrolling through my contacts until I found the number I had not needed in a very long time, and I paused for only a second before pressing call, listening to the ring with steady hands and a clear mind. When the voice on the other end answered, I spoke simply, setting an appointment, asking for guidance, not explaining everything, not needing to, because the decision itself was already made. I ended the call, placed the phone back on the counter, and glanced once more at the small silver box, now open, now ordinary, no longer carrying any weight at all. And as I stood there in the quiet light of the morning, I understood that they had believed the evening was about what they chose to hide from me. But in truth, it had shown me exactly what I needed to see, and what I chose to do next would not be shaped by their intentions, but by my own.